Have you ever criticized a fictional character only to be told, "You don't understand them because they're complex"? That's basically a canon event for everyone who's ever been to any fandom. Maybe you ignored this accusation and stood your ground, or maybe you started wondering, well, what if they are right? Maybe I did miss something. I've been on the receiving end of this accusation more times than I can count, and this may surprise you, but my default reaction is to assume I'm the one who's wrong. So I started reflecting on this issue, and rather than to find an answer to my doubts, I instead started wondering, what even is a complex character? The definition will vary depending on who you ask. Is it about character development, internal conflict, moral ambiguity, emotional range, or something else entirely? Because a character you consider complex will be called flat by someone else, and vice versa. All while there is a civil war in the background about a third character that you have no strong opinions on. And are these discussions about complex characters even done in good faith, or is "you don't understand this complex character" just a very convenient way to shut down an opponent? And while I don't think that there is a single clear definition of complexity, there is one pattern I keep seeing over and over again. People treating inconsistency as synonymous with complexity. Before we start, remember that you can show your appreciation of my videos by liking, subscribing and sharing. Make sure to click the notification button if you want to be up to date with everything. And if you prefer to listen to this on Spotify, check the link in the description. The concept of a complex character is often more akin to a thought-terminating cliché than an actual assessment of that character. This convenient phrase simultaneously achieves two things. 1. All the actions of the character are positioned as understandable acts undertaken by a complex individual, and 2. The opponent is implicitly accused of not grasping said complexity, which reflects poorly on their comprehension. The biggest issue here is that there exists no singular definition of what constitutes a complex character, and those will vary from person to person. One common denominator of what constitutes a complex character is someone who undergoes significant changes and development over the course of the story. But that presents us with two counter-questions. Is every character development made equal? Can a static character be complex if their role in the story does not require for them to be especially dynamic? Characters often pointed out as complex are those struggling with internal conflict. But then, is every character with such a conflict automatically complex, whereas the character that has conflicts other than internal ones isn't? A character who has a wide array of emotional reactions to the story's events may appear complex, but does it mean that an emotionally restrained character who consistently reacts to the events around them in a restrained way is not complex? Then maybe a complex character is simply synonymous with a well-written or simply compelling character. But then, what about characters who are well-written and otherwise compelling, but much of their internal lives, ambitions, or emotional reactions are not presented to us? Often, a character appears to be a complex person because they serve multiple functions in the narrative. But there are characters who have specific and often singular functions, like symbols or foils, that still feel complex. The invocation of complexity often happens when discussing morality, especially with villainous or antagonistic characters with sympathetic or understandable motivations. But does that automatically make them complex? Are generally morally upstanding or genuinely evil characters never complex? Sometimes the label of complexity is automatically used for characters belonging to demographics, usually presented in a very stereotypical manner, when those stereotypes are subverted. But is this always enough to warrant this classification, or are they simply more complex when compared to more stereotypical characters? Are certain genres more likely to have their characters labeled complex, regardless of actual writing, in comparison to other genres? Do all characters have to be complex for the story to be compelling, or is it fine if the supporting cast is not as complex as the main cast? Frankly, Does every single story need complex characters? At times, trauma and mental illness are believed to automatically qualify a character as complex, even if they are not well explored and even if there is not much else going on. It sometimes happens that the point of the character is to be contradictory, and it's meaningfully integrated into their broader arc. But just as often, when a character believes two opposing things, the story does not meaningfully explore this tension. A character might subjectively be perceived as complex simply because they are more difficult to understand than others. Does that automatically make them more complex, though? Similarly, a character may seem more complex because we are given a lot of information about them and spend a lot of time with them. But other characters with very little presence are still complex if every detail we're given about them constructs a coherent picture. By extension, is a character only complex because the narrative gives us access to their inner thoughts? Would the same character appear flat if viewed through someone else's point of view? Does complexity come from a character making difficult choices? Or can a mostly reactive character still be complex? How about thematic explorations? Because a character may embody multiple themes, while another character exists to convey only one clear theme. Does it automatically make the first character more complex? And what about acting like a real person? Because there are certainly highly stylized or archetypal characters that still feel layered. There are even instances where a character believed to be flat actually gains a lot of complexity upon a rewatch, and vice versa, loses it upon closer examination. Is complexity even something gradable? This character is more complex than the other one. Who gets to decide that? Are there even any coherent criteria that would help us measure it? How do we productively limit our implicit biases in our judgment to, say, avoid automatically labeling women as less complex than men? As you can see, there are too many questions and too few answers. We often end up arguing from opposing standpoints and different definitions. And here, I would add one more question. Is complexity something the text contains, or something that transformative fandom constructed? Because I have read the Harry Potter books numerous times as a young teenager, and yet when I saw the soliloquies about the complexity of Regulus Black, I went, wait, who the hell was that? And it's just some guy who died years before the story started. By nature of the transformative fandom, it's basically expected that the character as they exist in the fanon will differ from their canon characterization. This is basically encouraged. And it's fine on its own, though it's arguable whether this is the same character. The issue arises when this fanon characterization overrides the canon one or is blended and mixed because of the inability of the fans to put a firm line between the two. As such, Regulus Black is lauded as a deeply complex character because fanfiction, headcanons, and inferences make him so, but the real Regulus is just some guy who died. I will not try to attempt to define complexity as it pertains to characters, because I genuinely have no clear definition, nor do I want to settle for a definite definition. I can, however, define what complexity is not from the narrative point of view. To understand why inconsistency isn't automatically death, we need to address a very common assumption, that a well-written character should behave like a real person. It's not an inherently bad framework, but this definition needs critical nuance. While these characters usually qualify as Homo sapiens, they are actually not human beings. I don't only mean it in the they're not real way. Rather, it applies to the fact that a human being lives a life that isn't constrained to a narrative and doesn't exist as a tool to further this narrative or communicate its themes. By contrast, this is the constraint that a character is entirely defined by. For instance, you as a human being must eat, but a fictional character does not. You may write a story of a character's life ages 0 to 100 and never once show them do something as fundamental to human existence as consuming food. Conversely, you will probably not describe their every breakfast, dinner and supper just to remind your audience that you're writing about a human being. If the writer chooses to include a scene of a character eating, then it usually exists to communicate something about said character or the setting they inhabit. Is food something they enjoy? Is food tied to their culture or the way they bond with people? Is food scarce or plentiful in their world? Do they perhaps suffer from an eating disorder? And if so, what does that say about their personality or the setting they are in? And while all of those questions can as well be asked about a real human being, we human beings need to eat, while a character can go through their entire journey without being seen eating once, if the author decides that their relationship to food is not relevant to the story they're telling. If a writer insists on writing a character frequently consuming meals when food doesn't have much relevance to the overarching narrative, it may become tedious and repetitive for the reader, appear self-indulgent, or contradict something already established about the world or characters. This is one of the criticisms leveraged against Hanya Yanagihara. In To Paradise, as in A Little Life, sex is often portrayed as an inconvenient compulsion. Eros is reserved for food. At every possible juncture, Yanagihara describes the food on offer, including a mouth-watering array of cakes: peach cake, lemon cake, several different chocolate cakes, polenta cake, its surface glazed with candied rounds of orange, cake made with pureed apples that had been whisked into the batter, or with real strawberries swirled into the batter. The characters seem to approach the world with a running catalogue of their friends' favorite dishes and jams and varieties of cheese. When they have trouble making conversation, their go-to topics include yeast-free baking. They teach lovers to eat marrow, escargots, and artichokes, and long to introduce grandchildren to shrimp, sea urchin, and figs. Even the people who don't care about food seem to give it an exhaustive amount of thought. Food did not interest him, it's said of one David, before he recalls the ingredients of meals he sampled decades earlier. This is just one example of where the real human behavior approach actively works against a story. In essence, you must remember that a character is not a real human being, even if biologically they belong to the species of Homo sapiens, have human psyche and human emotions. Indeed, a skilled writer will make their characters seem like real humans to you, but a character acting like a real human being doesn't automatically translate to them being complex or even well written. In fact, in some instances, this will be a liability because while a real human being exists independently of the story, a fictional character only exists within it, and some human-like traits may not translate well to the format. Another example of the character as human being approach that isn't always productive is some people encouraging writers to craft dialogue the way real people speak. And while sometimes this approach makes sense, especially in small doses, like characters having certain speech quirks that help distinguish them, other times it will make the dialogue confusing and as such will fail to communicate relevant messages to the reader. Another thing is, if you want to create a character that has all the struggles of a real human being, you may stack too many problems or conflicts that will make it impossible to really define that character and will create a proverbial mess instead. Even though real human beings usually struggle with a wide variety of unrelated issues, unlike fictional characters whose problems are constructed around the narrative they are in. Indeed, real human beings will act in an inconsistent or contradictory manner. And while a character can be contradictory or inconsistent if that's the goal of thematic or narrative exploration, a contradictory or inconsistent character that's like this just for the sake of being this, because real human beings are like this, will not necessarily translate well into a narrative structure. And yet, the inconsistency is precisely often explained away by complexity. Complex characters act like human beings are inconsistent, therefore this is a complex character. But again, it isn't. Inconsistency isn't automatically synonymous with complexity. Usually, it's the exact opposite. First, I need to define what I mean by inconsistency in fictional characters. Luckily, it's way easier to grasp than complexity, and I think my definition will resonate with most viewers. An inconsistent character is someone whose personality and/or goals change without sufficient factors inducing it. Of course, what counts as sufficient is also subjective, but to provide an example of what I mean. One day a character is very loyal to their friend, but the next one they turn their back on them without some major falling out or other compelling reason. As such, you and I will probably agree that this is an inconsistent character. Usually this happens because the story needs a plot beat, but doesn't take time to justify it. As such, the character's established trait, loyalty, is contradicted in a way that could theoretically happen to a real human being, because real human beings are irrational. However, when a fictional character is introduced as loyal but changes without a sufficient trigger, that character becomes inconsistent. Regardless of how you define a complex character, a well-written character should have at least one goal. Those can range from something as minuscule as go on a date with a hot barista to things as grand as save the galaxy from impending doom. No matter the stakes, a goal is the first question you should have in mind when you begin constructing a character. Then, you define how will your character reach that goal, whether they succeed, and if there are circumstances in which they abandon the pursuit of that goal or change it entirely. For a character to change their goal, there usually has to be some sort of an external influence that justifies it. As such, if your character changes their goal for a reason that's not properly justified within the narrative, you will end up with an inconsistent character. I can think of exactly one character whose inconsistency actually makes sense within the narrative and his personality. Jace Tallis from Arcane. Jace's defining characteristic is that he is easily influenced and will do whatever someone he likes most at the moment tells him to do. This is one of the running jokes in the fandom. Even then, Jace has an underlying goal, the development and subsequent distribution of Hextech. The trials that came along with this goal make him act in an inconsistent manner. However, Jace is an outlier in terms of inconsistency, making sense for the character, and I would by no means label him as the most complex character in Arcane either. Usually, characters are inconsistent due to the writer's failure, and there is one character especially emblematic of this, in a show already riddled with inconsistent characterizations. And conversely, one most often defended by appeals to complexity. For the first 2 episodes of House of the Dragon Season 1, Alicent Hightower has a simple goal: mending the strained relationship with her best friend turned estranged stepdaughter, Rhaenyra. Those almost succeed until Alicent confronts Rhaenyra about her alleged visit to a brothel with her uncle Daemon. Rhaenyra insists on her chastity, and Alicent believes her, but Criston Cole reveals that he was the one who slept with Rhaenyra that night. Alicent's trust is broken, and although it's not communicated to us sufficiently enough, according to the actress playing young Alicent, the main factor here is that Alicent has feelings for Criston. The second crucial aspect to Alicent's fallout with Rhaenyra are the machinations of her father Otto, who insists that any children Alicent has with Viserys will be a threat to Rhaenyra, and thus, if she wants them to survive, she must prepare for her eldest son to rule. All this hardens Alicent's heart against Rhaenyra, and she symbolically declares war by embracing her house's colors during Rhaenyra's wedding feast. Subsequently, Alicent spends years undermining Rhaenyra's position at court, keeps the paternity of Rhaenyra's children a hot topic at all times, humiliates Rhaenyra during council meetings, and most importantly, turns her eldest son against Rhaenyra and her children in the same way her father did to her.
You are the challenge! You are the challenge, Aegon! Simply by living and breathing!
This conflict culminates with Alicent physically attacking Rhaenyra. She believes that her childhood friend does whatever she wants and gets away with it, whilst Alicent is confined to a loveless marriage and children she doesn't want via martial rape. The affection they once held for one another is long gone. Some more years pass, and even though Rhaenyra had permanently moved to Dragonstone, Alicent's scheming hasn't stopped. In episode 8, Vaemond Velaryon intends to petition Alicent, who rules in her husband's stead, about the inheritance of Driftmark, on the basis that Lucerys Velaryon, its current heir, is not the biological son of Laenor Velaryon, but Ser Harwin Strong. Such an accusation not only threatens Lucerys' inheritance of Driftmark, but also Rhaenyra's position as heir to the throne.
Your intimacy with the Princess Rhaenyra is an offence that would mean exile and death. For you, for her, for the children.
Should Vaemond be granted Driftmark ahead of Lucerys, it would validate the belief that he is legitimate. That in turn would make Rhaenyra liable to answering for high treason. In the best case scenario, she and her children will have to flee for their lives, and in the worst, she and all of her children will be executed. As such, Alicent accomplishes the goal she's had all these years, the line of succession cleared for her son Aegon. Alicent's goal shifted over time. First, it was to mend her relationship with Rhaenyra. When Rhaenyra did something Alicent deemed unforgivable and believed Otto's manipulation, the goal changed into undermining Rhaenyra's position for the sake of her son's ascension. There were clear triggers and clear shifts in motivation. Up to this point, everything tracks. And then, once Vaemon's petition fails, when a dying Viserys makes one last stance in defense of Rhaenyra and Daemon beheads Vaemond, Alicent's goal completely vanishes. Let's try and put ourselves in her position. Imagine you are a teenager and your dad forces you to marry a widower thrice your age, who is also your best friend's dad, all while you have feelings for someone else. Dad convinces you that said best friend is a threat to the lives of your children. You learn that said friend got to find love and companionship with a man you are in love with, and then she continues to have an affair with another man while you're stuck with a rotting corpse. By episode 5, Alicent is already committed to the idea that her son should inherit ahead of Rhaenyra. After all, that's how it has always been, and it's only right that Rhaenyra gets punished for moral transgressions, especially if your children's lives are at stake. Your years upon years of scheming culminates in the perfect opportunity to gain the Velaryon fleet and remove both Rhaenyra and her sons from the line of succession. Then your husband ruins it all. And you aren't mad? Aren't frustrated? You don't feel like this confirms everything you already believed in? You just accept it? You toast to Rhaenyra and unironically mean it when you say that she will make a fine queen? Having accepted with no resistance that a decade or so of plotting was smooth within 10 minutes, Alicent misunderstands the last words of her husband and gets convinced that, on his deathbed, he named Aegon as heir. After the same man spent years affirming that Rhaenyra is his heir and being willfully ignorant of the paternity of her sons. After he, a rotting corpse, climbed onto the Iron Throne one last time to defend her claim. If Alicent clings to this delirious rambling of a dying man as a defense mechanism that would salvage the years of scheming, then this as a trigger makes sense, even if she shouldn't have given up on her goal so easily after the throne room confrontation. Subsequently, she also shouldn't proceed with the actions to crown Aegon as reluctantly as she does in episode 9. But season 2 of House of the Dragon makes it very clear that Alicent didn't hear what she wanted to hear. She genuinely thought Viserys is naming Aegon as heir.
The Conqueror.
This makes her not only inconsistent, but also less intelligent. Moreover, the idea that Alicent was unaware of there being a broader conspiracy in crowning Aegon is laughable. I find the explanation of, well, they didn't involve her because she's a woman not sufficient enough. So all this scheming and plotting and Alicent didn't seek allies at court? Do you see this shit book, Alicent? But accepting that it is a sufficient explanation, Alicent being reluctant to ally herself with this conspiracy once it's revealed to her is also ridiculous. Given her trajectory thus far, Alicent should jump in joy at this moment. Years of scheming undone, Rhaenyra once more got away with not doing her duty and sacrifice because daddy said so, and yet, it's not at all in vain. This is the moment the character breaks. Everything Alicent believed about the world has just been confirmed. At this point of the story, they've been enemies for longer than they've been friends. But because the writers want her to remain sympathetic, they make her clueless and fearful instead. Those viewers who also want Alicent to remain sympathetic pivot to calling this inconsistency complexity because real human beings are inconsistent. But even a real human being would not give up years of scheming after all their beliefs about the world and Rhaenyra had just been confirmed. Compare and contrast to book Alicent. We meet her as a young woman that King Viserys chooses as his new bride. Initially, she and Rhaenyra, a decade or so her junior in this instance, share an amicable relationship, which shatters once Alicent gives birth to a son, but the order of succession is not changed. She, a queen consort, sees her son as robbed of rightful inheritance. That is a sufficient trigger for a change or introduction of a new goal. Put my son on the throne by any means necessary. This goal for Alicent stays consistent all throughout the war, and only vanishes when all of her family dies. Even if you label show Alicent as more complex, she is still more inconsistent than her book self because book Alicent has clear motivations while show Alicent doesn't. What is more, is show Alicent more complex because of the genuine effort of the writers, or were they always at an advantage due to the nature of the medium? Fire and Blood is a historical record written decades after the dust has settled, whereas Show Alicent is a physically present, breathing, and living individual. That by itself gives an impression of greater complexity. I can already imagine attempts at trying to explain Alicent's inconsistent characterization from a Watsonian point of view. What is actually more productive is to look at it from a Doylist point of view. The writers have a pattern of inconsistent characterization, and that impacted Alicent among others. Much the same happens to Aemond, who had his eye gouged out during an altercation with Lucerys, chases Lucerys on the biggest dragon in the world while screaming, "You owe me a debt." And then, when Vhagar jumps on Luke, Aemond looks horrified. So, what was this chase for if he didn't actually want to kill him? Simple. The writer couldn't commit to a consistent goal for this character. Rhaenys Targaryen barges through the floor of the dragon pit, murders hundreds of innocent people, but doesn't end the war here and there by killing the Greens. While she warns Rhaenyra of her usurpation, she doesn't declare for her because it's not her war. What the fuck do you mean it's not your war? You just agreed to betroth your beloved granddaughter to the heir to the throne. It is your war. Later, she uses her husband to actually declare for Rhaenyra after all, and this change in outlook is a bit less jarring once you know of a deleted scene between Rhaenys' granddaughter Baela, whose eagerness to back her stepmother reminds Rhaenys of her deceased child. Then, Rhaenys volunteers to go to Rook's Rest, where she is confronted by Aegon and surprised by Vhagar's appearance. Since Aemond targets Aegon, Rhaenys is able to escape, but then goes back to continue fighting? Why? Does she have a good reason for that? Because in the books, she stays to fight, even though she has no chance to survive a 2 versus 1. Here, she has a chance to escape, but stays behind, manages to get an upper hand, and then dies in a sneak attack anyway. Why did she turn away? We don't know. Is it guilt, regret, sense of duty? The show never establishes it. But there is arguably a character whose inconsistency is even worse, and it seems like actual malice on behalf of the writers. While George R. R. Martin named Daemon Targaryen as his favorite member of the Targaryen family, the writers of House of the Dragon do not share this belief and are in an endless struggle with their audiences because they feel it's wrong that they enjoy this character. For the majority of Season 1, Daemon is actually pretty consistent in terms of personality, motivations, and goals. They change over the course of the story when Daemon grows and matures. He first chases the crown, then he chases Rhaenyra so that he can rule through her, and then gradually accepts that he will never be king. Whether Daemon marries Rhaenyra as a power play to rule through her is not possible to conclusively discern, but for the sake of the argument, let's accept this interpretation as true. After Viserys' death, Daemon crowns her himself and is the first to kneel. Regardless of why he does this, he accepted Rhaenyra's queenship to some degree. That is a consistent character trajectory. Until Daemon decides to pursue the crown himself in Season 2. In the books, by the time the dance starts, Daemon had already finished his character development. The rogue prince gave up the idea of being king and dedicated his life to the claim of his wife. In the show, Daemon instead embarks on a season-long ayahuasca trip in Harrenhal. Daemon crowned Rhaenyra himself, then suddenly decided, actually I will gather an army on my behalf, and changed his mind not because of any internal work, but because of another vision. Here, the trigger to change his goal is present, but reads more like a cheap cop-out because Daemon hasn't really done any internal work from these visions. It's very likely that he will change his mind in Season 3 once again if the inconsistency pattern continues. And given George R. R. Martin's comments, it's basically to be expected. All of those characters are inconsistent, but the most inconsistent one is regularly defended as actually complex. And even if we assume that I'm wrong and Alicent actually is complex, you can dislike a character even if they're complex. And you fully grasp their complexity. Which is why the response to you expressing your dislike being, you don't get it because you can grasp their complexity, so often feels like a thought-terminating cliché. Every single person around you is complex, yet, do you like everyone equally? Is there someone in your life whose actions you can understand but you still hate them? Probably yes. So, why would fictional characters be different? While I still can't give you a precise definition of a complex character, I think it's fair to assume that flat/complex is not a dichotomy. More often than not, characters fall somewhere on the spectrum, and even then, we cannot always be sure if it's our subjective assessment or not. Moreover, a character doesn't start as complex or flat. Whether they become complex depends on the skill of the writer. But just like a character can become more complex, they can become less complex over time. And one of the fastest ways to flatten a character is inconsistency. Not because they change, but because the logic behind their actions stop being internally coherent. We already went over Alicent and Daemon and why I believe that the issue of inconsistency is applicable to most of the cast of House of the Dragon. But that inconsistency was already a pattern present in Season 1. There is another show where the drop in quality and, by extension, character complexity is so strong between seasons that it becomes jarring. Yet the appeals to complexity are most often invoked in the worst season. This show proves that not only is inconsistency not complexity, but that inconsistency actively destroys complexity.
Maybe Arcane was the friends we made along the way.
In Arcane, the majority of the praise for Season 1 went to the writing of the characters. No matter how trivial they were in the grand scheme of things, all of them gave the impression of having rich internal lives, compelling motivations and conflicts, both internal and external. The villains and antagonists were constructed with as much care and attention as the heroes, and Arcane actually did something that seemed impossible to me before. Wrote a sympathetic female villain that you want to see heal and grow in spite of the atrocities she committed. Something that is usually reserved for male characters. At no point are characters contradictory. Every single decision they make stems from their established personality and motivations. Even those known for their unpredictability, such as Jinx, do not actually act randomly. Every single crazy thing Jinx does stems from her personality, conflicts, goals, and her motivations. Most of these characters undergo significant development in response to external circumstances, but they do not become completely different people. At least not until Season 2, where inconsistencies crept in. And like with Alicent and House of the Dragon, these inconsistencies are also explained away by complexity. It would make the video extremely long if I discussed every single character that Season 2 of Arcane failed. There are already plenty of essays about that, and I don't have anything meaningful to add to this conversation. I can instead show you why this is a pattern. In order to keep these takes balanced, I will first whack my favorite character before I whack my least favorite character. In the case of the least favorite character, the reasoning for the you don't get her because she's complex is eerily similar to the approach to Alicent Hightower, which may have something to do with my dislike of both. In Season 1, Powder is a child whose life revolves around the approval of her older sister Vi, so when she forces her to stay behind when Vander is kidnapped, Powder's world falls apart. She can only sit and wait with the awareness that all of them might die, nursing the wound of receiving confirmation that Vi too considers her a liability. Wishing to prove herself, Powder causes an explosion that kills both of her brothers and Vi affirms her worst fears. She is a jinx. Silco then encourages her to embrace distraction as part of her identity, to embrace being Jinx. Adult Jinx struggles with severe mental illness and is indiscriminately killing people for the sake of her new dad's drag empire. Vi tries to mend their relationship, but they're too different now. The season concludes with Jinx kidnapping Caitlyn, Vi and Silco, and gives her sister a choice. Kill Caitlyn and you will have Powder back. She then suffers a mental breakdown, kills Silco, and fully embraces being Jinx. Jinx is damaged, crazy, sad, funny, loving, and paranoid all at once, and even though various parties wrestle for control over her, she is never passive or reactive. Even when she does morally reprehensible things, the narrative doesn't ask you to condemn her, but to understand her, and when you do, you want to believe that there is still hope for her. And what happens in Season 2? Jinx is gone. This does not happen immediately, and some of Jinx's essence is still there. But the internal conflict that marred her entire struggle in Season 1 diminishes over time. She fully embraced her Jinx identity, but once she meets a child plot device, she declares Jinx is dead. Why? What prompted you to declare it so casually? Was there anything that triggered this realization? Because for Jinx to embrace the persona she now claims to be dead, she needed an entire season of internal struggle. In order to declare this, she needs to hang out with a child. You can only guess what prompted her to declare this. Indeed, Arcane Season 2 is a show you imagine and not watch. The essence resembling Jinx is still there, but she is infinitely less complex than her Season 1 counterpart, and that lack of complexity stems precisely from this new inconsistent writing. Previously, declaring Jinx to be dead would need an entire season of build-up. In Season 2, it's a throwaway line. You need time to establish your character as complex, and even more time to deepen her complexity. When you skip the process and don't show changes in goals and personality with enough care, inconsistencies slip in and complexity collapses. I would not put Caitlyn Kiramman as the most complex character in the entirety of Arcane. I believe her to be slightly more archetypal than others, the person who grew up privileged, slowly starting to empathize with the oppressed. But her being archetypal by no means takes away from her character, and it's okay if she does not ultimately follow that path and breaks off her solidarity with the oppressed, especially because narratively she has good reasons for that. Jinx's rocket kills her mother, and the memorial attack further hardens her heart against Zon. She asks Vi to put on a badge of the organization that murdered her parents, commits chemical warfare, and hits Vi when she asks why she almost killed a child in the pursuit of killing her arch-nemesis. Caitlyn is then proclaimed a dictator and utilizes police brutality to accomplish her goals. The corruption arc is a bit rushed, but makes general sense in our framework. Caitlyn's goal changes in response to justified external triggers, and in theory, a redemption arc from those actions is possible and would actually be pretty powerful. There's very little redemption arcs that aren't just giving war criminals sympathetic reasons for the way they are, and redemption arcs for women are extremely rare to begin with. But Caitlyn simply changed her mind one day and returned to the good side just in time for the final battle, never once reckoning with the consequences of her actions. This cannot be called a redemption arc. Caitlyn is simply put back at step 1 of her narrative, and much like in the case of Jinx, the time required for her redemption is skipped, she does not evolve in any way. This causes inconsistency, and as such, complexity collapses.
Why is peace always the justification for violence?
I don't know, Kate, you tell me. The shift with the level of complexity is seen in every single character, not just Jinx and Caitlyn. Vi becomes a plot device for Jinx and Caitlyn and may actually be the most washed character in the entire story. Heimerdinger's existential threat related to the arcane powers disappears, and he's just a funny hamster guy. Echo's entire political arc gets sidelined for the sake of a ship. Mel is on a side quest to fight some magicians. They did not even spare Silco, who only appears as a posthumous hallucination.
I thought I could break free by eliminating those I deemed my jailers. But Jinx, I think the cycle only ends when you find the will to walk away.
He would not say that. Yet among all of those, there is only one whose inconsistency is explained away by complexity. Caitlyn. Even though her Season 2 self is much less complex than her Season 1 self, and even though Season 2 makes no effort to have her change her mind and become one of the good guys once more, much less to at least acknowledge her mistakes. In fact, a lot of this is likely the result of defining complexity as synonymous with moral greyness or even villainy. Season 1 Caitlyn is guided by her compassion and the desire to do the right thing, and while she is not perfect, her efforts matter. Season 2 Caitlyn is pushed towards more villainous and morally questionable decisions. But do they make her inherently more complex? Or is this an illusion caused by the fact that moral ambiguity is equated with complexity? Caitlyn was complex, but lost this complexity through inconsistent writing. And rather than to recognize this as inconsistency, it's explained as complexity, even when inconsistency is at best a liability, and at worst, the antithesis of complexity. What initially made Caitlyn compelling wasn't that she was acting irrationally the way a human being does, only that you perfectly understood why she did it. Once that link was severed and Caitlyn started being tossed through pre-decided plot points without the triggers necessary for that, complexity collapsed. That's the difference. A complex character invites you to ask why. An inconsistent one forces you to shrug and move on, and saying you don't get her because she's complex is precisely that shrug. Discussing character complexity will inevitably lead to disagreements because we operate under different definitions. But when inconsistency is labeled complexity, the argument becomes incoherent writing is admirable. Since complexity is mostly subjective, rather than to try and place characters on the binary of complex/flat, the better questions to ask ourselves are, do we understand their goals? Do changes in their characterization, motivation, and goals have sufficient reasoning? Is their transformation earned? Too often, these questions are ignored because it's easier to simplify it into a character seems real human beings are inconsistent, therefore inconsistency qualifies a character as complex. More often than not, however, this defense exists to deflect against criticism of poor writing choices. Because the character as human being framework obfuscates the fact that a fictional character does not make decisions, the writer does. It's often way more productive to ask if there was a failure on their behalf than to search for in-universe explanations for inconsistent characterization, especially if it's a pattern visible in other characters as well. A complex character invites you to ask, why are you like this? An inconsistent one forces you to accept whatever they do without any deeper retrospection. And if we equate this with complexity, that retrospection is discouraged. Thanks for watching. Remember that you can show your appreciation of my videos by liking, subscribing and sharing. Make sure to click the notification button if you want to be up to date with everything. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes, and ashes always land on top.